This is David Roach, Independent Strategy, Quantum Economics. A number of you have asked me about what's happening on COVID. Is it a threat to the world economy? Or what about the new Delta variant? The contrast, to my mind, is the UK has approximately 27,000 cases a day and is opening up and rejoicing. And China has about 200 cases a day and is locking down and disrupting. Why is the world so different in the face of a similar virus? Well, first of all, let's update on what this virus actually means for the world. It is not causing the economies to tank, because the social measures which would cause that to happen are being lifted and not put in place by democratic governments around the world, because these governments have worked out that they're more vulnerable to hostility from the masses because of lockdowns than they are about the sorrow caused by ongoing infections, which have now spread predominantly to young people, and deaths. So that's their calculation. Now, what actually is the background to this? Well, the background is that daily cases, the number of people who get this disease, this particular variant, Delta, every day is running on average per week at around 600,000. Some days it's 500,000 or 450, and some days it's closer to 800,000. The infection rate of the disease is kind of constant. It is not exponential. The rate in daily new cases was 8% in the last 7 days, 8% in the 7 days before that, and 8% 7 days before that. And active cases worldwide are rising by about 9%. What is interesting, and in a sense foreboding, is the fact that contrary to claims from many governments, there is no evidence that this disease is less fatal or puts less people in hospital than other variants of COVID. If we look at the infection rates for Delta, we find that there's been, in the last 5 weeks, an approximately 50% increase in total cases worldwide, which is matched by an increase of approximately 50% in hospitalizations among the 23 developed countries, North America and Europe, which actually report on such matters. And the same goes for ICU. And in the United States, where we've seen over a 30% increase in infections per day in this week alone, there is a proportionate increase in deaths. So the idea that this is, it's all very fine, we're going to open up and we're going to have a jolly time being ponied about by democratic governments is, to say the least, not based on them knowing more about the disease than you and I. And what we know is that this is not more deadly, not certainly more likely to put people in hospital than previous strains, but neither is it less likely. So let's not underestimate it, let's not overestimate it, let's live with the fact that for the moment it's infectious and it is not causing a collapse in the economic recovery for two good reasons. One, if you open up, then your Google activity and economic activity indices don't react to the disease. And two, people have become indifferent to the presence of the disease, and in many ways, and typically indifferent to the plight of others who actually get the disease. So the path in the Western democratic economies is very likely to be one of gradual recovery, continuing without the disease stopping that, but certainly putting a cap on animal spirits, particularly if it gets worse, which it's highly likely to do. Interestingly, the worldwide reign of COVID at the moment is not being accelerated by emerging markets in general. The developing economies where Delta is really bad are places in Southeast Asia, like Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and some of the smaller economies. But in Africa and Latin America and South Asia, meaning India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh principally, the actual number of cases per day has plateaued and is not accelerating. So either they have developed immunity or they are about to get hit with the umpteenth wave. But at the moment, what is driving the increase of 8.5% to 9% in active cases in COVID and daily infections are the developed economies, plus 3 or 4 major Southeast Asian economies with very low vaccination rates. I have not answered the question about China, so I'm going to answer it now. Why does China, with 196 or 120 cases a day, not rejoice like the UK with 27,000? And the answer is both fascinating and it is also material for the global economy. The reason is because China has administered approximately 1.7, 1.8 billion vaccines, which is a lot of vaccines. But then there are also rather a lot of people in China. And this works out at a little over a vaccination rate of 1 vaccination shot for every person living in China. Now, the Chinese vaccinations being used have 2 characteristics. One is they're 2-shot vaccines. So if you vaccinated everybody once, you have not vaccinated people twice. They're not fully inoculated. The second thing is that Chinese vaccines have an efficacy rate, meaning their ability to stop the disease, you getting the disease, of approximately 58%, just below 60%, compared to, say, Moderna or BioNTech of around 98%. So the immunity factor imparted by vaccinations is lower. That's not a criticism of the vaccines, it's a fact of life. So if you want to achieve herd immunity in China, you first have to ask yourself, what is herd immunity? Well, the herd immunity is when everybody's got enough antibodies for the disease not to spread. That can be because everybody's had the disease or carried the disease, or it can be because you vaccinated everybody. We know that in the case of Delta, herd immunity is 80 or 90% of the population has to have the antibodies, vaccinations, or having had the disease or carried the disease. In the case of previous COVID strains, it was approximately 30%. After 30%, even single shots, the vaccine actually caused the number of daily infections to decline. That is no longer the case with Delta. So it's a race between getting herd immunity and the infection rate of Delta, which is high, very high. In China, in order to achieve the 80%, let's say, herd immunity rate, you would have to increase the number of vaccines by 60%. That is a huge figure, given that vaccines, total amount, the vaccinations administered in total every week are only increasing at about 7%. So it would take you 2 or 3 months, maybe longer, to achieve total vaccination rates. And even if you did, because the efficacy rate is 60%, you would still have 40% of all of those vaccinated people, which is a huge amount of people, who would theoretically still be vulnerable to the vaccine, to the disease. So China's policy is dictated by the fact that they have double shot vaccines and they have administered, doing with huge endeavor, only 1 on average per person of those shots. And they have to get 2 into everybody in order to achieve the sort of vaccination levels which would impact the ability of Delta to infect everybody. And China's policy is also dictated by the fact that the efficacy rate of the vaccines is relatively low at below 60%. So even if they did carry out all those vaccinations, they would still have a vulnerable population of the order of 30%. This is why the idea, which is ponied around, that the Chinese are really being terribly foolish, whereas Boris Johnson is being terribly intelligent, in shutting down, which the Chinese are doing for the centers of infection, which I'll come to in a second, whereas the Europeans are much, much cleverer and the Americans much, much cleverer. They just open up and have a party. The Chinese are doing this for a very rational reason, and that is because their population is very vulnerable to this particular very infectious strain of COVID, the Delta variety. Therefore, they have no choice but to pursue a policy of zero tolerance for COVID. Whereas other countries are saying, well, it's okay, it'll always be there, but it'll only affect X% of the population, and politically we'll be fine. China does not have those prerogatives. Its population is much more vulnerable due to the huge amount of people who've only had one shot. It is much more vulnerable because the vaccine efficacy rate is lower, and the government is much less vulnerable to imposing lockdowns, etc., because they're not elected. Whereas in the Western democracies, the unpopularity of lockdowns is politically more costly than the tragic costs in terms of loss and health of ongoing infections with the vaccines. So that's why China has no choice but to pursue a zero tolerance policy towards COVID. However, a zero tolerance policy has a high economic cost. As we know, when all economies in the world were locked down, the economic cost was huge. So the economic cost of what China is doing is big. What China is actually doing is to lock down in areas, local government areas or cities where Delta has spread. Now, those are principally and not exclusively Jiangsu, which includes Nanjing, where this outbreak actually started, though I would pretend the second one, Yunnan, is really where it started, and Henan and Hunan. These are the four major centers. Now, those cities are basically cut off as regards transport. In the capital of one, Wuhan, 11 million people have been tested for the disease in the last couple of days, which goes to show the Chinese are capable of when they get going. So they are taking the route of having lockdowns, having very strict controls on social contact and so on, and cutting off transport into these hubs of the virus. What does that mean? Well, it means that goods and services don't move either. Principally, and particularly goods. And that affects, of course, Chinese impact on world trade, where after all, China is the third biggest economy in the world. So if its supply lines are being disrupted as they are at the moment, it is going to impact world trade, it's going to impact global growth figures, and China's growth rate is going to come down from a very rapid rate of recovery from the COVID pandemic down to about 3% in the current quarter. Because of this, and also because of things we've talked about before, like new regulations being imposed on the private sector by the Chinese Communist Party to exercise control. So the reality is, this is a high-cost business. If you take one single symbol, let's take the cost of a container in Shanghai port, which is meant to go to either the west coast of the United States or to Europe. The cost of that container today is between 5 to 7 times what it was in the 5 years preceding the pandemic. Now, this is way beyond the any economic cost that a container should command. And the reason it is so high is because what past and the present epidemic is doing in China and thus internationally is to prevent containers being in the right place at the right time. So the prices get bid up in the places where they are not, and the containers stack up in the places where they are. This result is symbolic of the amount of disruption going on in international trade, and it has large knock-on effects. The low value-added exporting sectors in China, like furniture, can't possibly afford those sort of transport costs to sell their wares in Europe or the United States. There's a hit. Even high value-added sectors are having trouble in getting their supplies in the right place at the right time, which is partly what the disruption in many sectors called COVID scarring is all about, and why it is pushing inflation in the West. Now, I would say if you're an investor or an economic forecaster, you do not want to get into a state of indifference about COVID, because it has been and it is affecting international pricing, anticipated inflation rates and expectations, and will go on doing so. The result of this will be to add to global inflation, which is the single biggest threat to global financial markets, because it puts all the central banks who are busy printing money for nothing and asking you to take it away by the barrow load or truckload for free. It puts them all on the wrong foot. And it is a contributing factor to the reality that the economic cycle that we're experiencing in around the world is very abnormal, where sectors become unconstrained and experience excess demand, followed by a very rapid decline towards a convergence towards a trend growth rate, and where other sectors remain locked down and in supply shortage, where consumption cannot occur, like automobiles, which will experience excess demand later, but at the moment do not. So the world is in a sawtooth pattern, not in unison, but per sector, per locality, per country. And thinking about that in those terms should be the way that you think about the effect of the pandemic, while keeping, of course, a human conscience and feeling for the fact that the pandemic is primarily a human tragedy.